Lord Edward Blackwood stood frozen in the dusty attic of Raven's Hollow Manor, his trembling hands clutching a worn leather diary. The morning light filtered through the cobwebbed window, illuminating the delicate handwriting on the yellowed pages. It belonged to his wife, Lady Catherine, who had passed away 3 months ago after a sudden illness. Edward had come to the attic searching for old family portraits to display at the memorial service planned for next week. Instead, he had discovered this diary hidden behind a loose wooden panel in the wall. The first line he read made his knees buckle, and he collapsed onto an old trunk, his face draining of all color. "My dearest diary, I write this knowing that one day the truth must come to light. My son Alexander is not Edward's child." The words seemed to dance before his eyes as Edward struggled to comprehend what he was reading. Alexander, his beloved son and heir to the Blackwood estate, the pride of his life for 25 years, was not his biological son. Edward's chest tightened, as if an invisible hand was squeezing his heart. Catherine's elegant script continued across the page, each word cutting deeper than the last. She wrote about a summer 26 years ago when Edward had been away on business in London for several months. The estate had felt empty and cold without him, and she had been desperately lonely. During that time, a young artist named Marcus Ashford had arrived at Raven's Hollow Manor. He had been commissioned by Edward himself to paint a series of landscapes of their vast grounds. Marcus was charming, passionate about his art, and full of life in a way that made the manor feel warm again. Edward's hands shook violently as he read how Catherine and Marcus had grown close over long conversations about art, literature, and dreams. She described how Marcus would paint while she read to him in the garden, how they would take long walks through the grounds discussing philosophy and poetry. The loneliness that had consumed her began to fade in his presence. The diary detailed how their friendship had slowly transformed into something more. Catherine wrote about fighting her feelings, knowing it was wrong, but the isolation and Marcus's gentle attention had worn down her defenses. One evening, after a particularly beautiful sunset they had watched together from the hilltop overlooking the estate, they had shared a kiss. Edward felt his world crumbling around him as he read on. Catherine described her guilt and confusion, how she had tried to distance herself from Marcus afterward, but the damage was done. Her feelings had overwhelmed her judgment, and during a summer storm that had trapped them together in the manor while the staff was away at the village festival, they had given in to their passion. The diary revealed that Catherine had discovered she was pregnant just weeks after Marcus had completed his commission and left Ravenshollow. Edward had returned from London shortly after, overjoyed to be home, and Catherine had never found the courage to tell him the truth. When Alexander was born, everyone commented on how he had his mother's eyes and delicate features. No one questioned his parentage. Edward's mind raced back through the years, searching for signs he had missed. Alexander did have Catherine's dark eyes and refined features, but Edward had always assumed their son simply took after his mother's side of the family. Now, every memory felt tainted with deception. The diary went on to describe Catherine's decades of guilt. She wrote about watching Edward's pride in Alexander, how he would boast about his son's achievements to anyone who would listen. She described lying awake at night, wanting to confess but terrified of destroying their family. She had considered telling the truth countless times but could never bear the thought of hurting Edward or Alexander. Edward stood up abruptly, pacing the dusty attic floor. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, betrayal, anger, confusion, and a deep aching sadness. Everything he had believed about his life, his marriage, his family, had been built on a lie. The woman he had loved and trusted for 30 years had deceived him in the most fundamental way possible. As he continued reading, Catherine's words revealed more painful truths. She wrote about seeing Marcus once more, 15 years after their affair, at a gallery opening in London. He had become a successful artist, married with children of his own. They had spoken briefly, politely, like strangers. But Catherine had seen Alexander in his features, the same strong jawline, the same way of tilting his head when thinking. The diary also revealed that Catherine had secretly followed Marcus's career over the years, cutting out newspaper articles about his exhibitions and keeping them hidden. She had even anonymously purchased one of his paintings, storing it wrapped in the cellar, unable to display it but equally unable to let it go. Edward sank back onto the trunk, overwhelmed. He thought about Alexander, now a successful barrister in London, engaged to be married next spring. How could he look at his son, the boy he had raised, taught to ride, sent to the best schools, loved unconditionally, knowing he was another man's child? How could he stand at Catherine's memorial service next week and speak of their loving marriage when it had all been a facade? The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the attic. Edward realized he had been reading for hours, completely absorbed in the devastating revelations. His legs felt weak as he stood, still clutching the diary. He needed air, needed to think, needed to decide what to do with this terrible knowledge. As he made his way toward the attic stairs, Edward caught sight of an old family portrait leaning against the wall. Himself, Catherine, and young Alexander, painted when the boy was about 10. They looked so happy, so perfect, the ideal, noble family. Now the painting seemed like a cruel joke, a beautiful lie preserved in oils. Edward descended the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. He could hear the household staff going about their morning duties, unaware that their master's world had just shattered. His butler, Jenkins, appeared at the bottom of the stairs, concern evident on his weathered face. "My lord, are you quite well?" "You look terribly pale," Jenkins said, reaching out to steady Edward. Edward waved him off, unable to speak. He stumbled toward his study, still clutching the diary. Once inside, he locked the door and collapsed into his leather chair. The room, with its mahogany panels and portraits of Blackwood ancestors, had always been his sanctuary. Now it felt suffocating. He opened the diary again, hoping desperately that he had misread, misunderstood, that there was some explanation that would make this nightmare disappear. But Catherine's words remained unchanged, her confession clear and undeniable. She had even included dates, details that Edward could verify against his own memories of that summer long ago. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Edward look up. Through the study window, he could see a car approaching the manor. His heart stopped as he recognized it, Alexander's silver Mercedes. His son was arriving for the weekend, as he did every month, to help with estate matters and spend time with his father. Edward watched as Alexander stepped out of the car, tall and confident, smiling as he greeted the gardener. The young man had no idea that his entire identity was about to be called into question, that the father who had raised him was not his biological parent, that his mother had carried this secret to her grave. As Alexander's footsteps approached the study, Edward made a desperate decision. He quickly hid the diary in his desk drawer and tried to compose himself. When the knock came, he called out in a voice that sounded surprisingly steady, "Come in." Alexander entered, his face bright with his usual warmth. "Father, Jenkins said you were in the attic all morning. Found anything interesting for Mother's memorial?" Edward forced a smile, though it felt like his face might crack from the effort. "Just some old photographs," he lied, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Nothing of particular note." Alexander studied his father with concern. "Are you feeling all right? You look rather unwell." "Just tired," Edward managed. "It's been difficult going through your mother's things." Alexander moved closer, placing a comforting hand on his father's shoulder. The gesture, meant to console, only made Edward's heart ache more. This young man, whom he loved as a son, whom he had always believed was his son, was a stranger's child. Yet the love Edward felt for him hadn't diminished even slightly. If anything, the potential loss made it more acute. "I understand," Alexander said softly. "I miss her too. But she would want us to celebrate her life, not mourn forever. The memorial will be a chance for everyone who loved her to share their memories." Edward nodded, unable to trust his voice. How could there be a memorial now? How could he stand before their friends and family and speak of Catherine's virtue and their happy marriage? Yet how could he cancel it without explaining why? Alexander sat down across from his father, unaware of the diary hidden just inches away. "I've prepared a speech for the memorial," he said. "Would you like to hear it?" "Perhaps later," Edward said quickly. He couldn't bear to hear Alexander speak lovingly of his mother right now, not with her confession fresh in his mind. They sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment before Alexander spoke again. "Father, I know this is a difficult time, but I have some happy news. Elizabeth and I have set a date for the wedding, June 15th. We'd like to have it here at Raven's Hollow, if that's agreeable to you." A wedding. Another family celebration built on the foundation of lies. Edward felt the room spinning slightly. "That's wonderful news," he forced himself to say. Alexander beamed. "Elizabeth is thrilled. She's always dreamed of a summer wedding in the gardens. Mother would have loved planning it with her." The mention of Catherine was like a knife twisting in Edward's chest. He stood abruptly, turning toward the window to hide his expression. "Alexander, I'm not feeling well. Perhaps we could discuss the wedding plans later?" "Of course," Alexander said, rising immediately. "Should I call Dr. Morrison?" No, I just need some rest." Edward kept his back turned, not trusting himself to face his son. Or was Alexander even his son anymore? After Alexander left, closing the door quietly behind him, Edward returned to his desk and pulled out the diary. There were still many pages left unread, more secrets waiting to be revealed. Part of him wanted to burn it, to pretend he had never found it, to preserve the illusion of the life he had known. But he knew he couldn't. The truth, once discovered, demanded to be fully known. As the afternoon sun slanted through the study windows, Edward began reading again, preparing himself for whatever other revelations Catherine's secret diary might contain. His life as Lord Edward Blackwood, proud father and widowed husband, was over. What remained to be seen was who he would become now that the truth had finally come to light. The weekend passed in a blur of carefully maintained facades. Edward managed to avoid any lengthy conversations with Alexander, claiming headaches and fatigue whenever his son expressed concern. But he could see the worry growing in Alexander's eyes, the way he would exchange glances with the staff, the quiet conversations that stopped when Edward entered a room. On Sunday evening, after Alexander had departed for London, Edward returned to the diary. He had barely slept, barely eaten, sustained only by the compulsion to know everything. As he read deeper into Catherine's confessions, new revelations emerged that made his situation even more complex. Catherine had written about Marcus attempting to contact her several times over the years. He had sent letters to the manor, which she had burned unread, terrified that someone might discover them. But one letter had arrived 10 years ago that she couldn't ignore. Marcus was dying of cancer and wanted to make amends for the past. He had never known about Alexander, Catherine had made sure of that, but he wanted her forgiveness for the pain their affair must have caused her. Edward's hands clenched as he read about Catherine's secret visit to Marcus's deathbed. She had told Edward she was visiting her sister in Bath, but instead had traveled to a hospital in Manchester. There, she had sat with the man who had fathered her child, holding his hand as he spoke of his regrets. Marcus had given her a letter for Alexander, just in case he ever learned the truth. Catherine had hidden this letter with her diary. Edward searched frantically through the remaining pages until a sealed envelope fell out. His name was not on it. It was addressed simply to "My unknown son." The weight of it in his hands was enormous. Here was a message from Alexander's biological father, words that could either heal or further wound the young man who had no idea his entire identity was false. The diary revealed more of Catherine's inner turmoil in her final years. She wrote about watching Alexander grow to look more and more like Marcus, the same artistic sensibilities, the same way of gesturing when speaking passionately about something, the same laugh. She described the agony of keeping the secret from both Edward and Alexander, especially as her health began to fail. In one particularly painful entry, Catherine had written about overhearing Edward tell a friend that Alexander was the best thing that ever happened to us, and how she had locked herself in her room and wept for hours afterward. She loved Edward deeply. The diary made that clear, and the guilt of her deception had been a constant poison in their marriage. Edward set the diary aside and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where Catherine and Marcus had once walked together. The landscaped gardens, the ancient oaks, the rolling hills, all of it had witnessed the betrayal that had shaped his entire adult life. He wondered if the staff had known, if there had been whispers and speculation he had been too blind to notice. A knock at the study door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, hastily hiding the diary and letter. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, entered with a tea tray. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but you haven't eaten all day. I've brought some sandwiches and tea." Edward nodded his thanks, not trusting his voice. Mrs. Pemberton had been with them for 20 years. Had she suspected? As she set down the tray, her kind eyes studied him with concern. "My lord, if I may speak freely," she began hesitantly, "the staff is worried about you. Since Lady Catherine's passing, you've not been yourself, but this weekend, Lord Alexander was quite concerned when he left." "I'm fine, Mrs. Pemberton," Edward said automatically. She pursed her lips, clearly unconvinced. "Her ladyship wouldn't want you to grieve yourself into illness, my lord. She loved you very much." The words were meant to comfort, but they struck Edward like physical blows. After Mrs. Pemberton left, he slumped in his chair, staring at the untouched food. How could Catherine have loved him while living such a monumental lie? Was it possible to love someone and deceive them so completely? As night fell, Edward made a decision. He couldn't face the memorial service, couldn't stand before their friends and family and praise Catherine's memory while knowing the truth. But canceling would require an explanation. He needed advice, someone he could trust with this devastating secret. His younger brother James came to mind. James was a judge, accustomed to dealing with complex moral and legal situations. They had always been close, and James had never been one to gossip. Edward picked up the telephone with trembling hands and dialed. "Edward?" James's voice was warm but concerned. "It's rather late." "Is everything all right?" "James, I need to see you. Tomorrow, if possible. It's urgent." "Of course. Should I come to Raven's Hollow?" "No," Edward said quickly. "I'll come to your chambers in London. This needs to be private." The concern in James's voice deepened. "Edward, what's happened? I can't explain over the telephone, just please make time for me tomorrow." After ending the call, Edward returned to the diary. The final entries were the most heartbreaking. Catherine, knowing her illness was terminal, had agonized over whether to tell the truth before she died. She wrote about starting to confess to Edward multiple times, but losing her courage. She described looking at Alexander during what she knew was her last Christmas and being unable to destroy his world. Her final entry was dated just a week before her death. "I am a coward. I will take this secret to my grave rather than hurt the two men I love most in this world. Perhaps that is my punishment, to die with this weight on my soul. I pray that if this diary is ever found, Edward and Alexander will find it in their hearts to forgive a woman who loved them both more than she loved truth or honor. My sin was not in loving Marcus for that brief moment, but in the decades of deception that followed. May God have mercy on me. Edward closed the diary, tears streaming down his face. Despite everything, he could hear Catherine's voice in those words, feel her anguish. The anger that had sustained him was giving way to a deep, encompassing grief, not just for Catherine's death, but for the marriage he thought they'd had, the family he thought they'd built. The next morning, Edward took an early train to London. The familiar journey felt surreal, as if he were watching someone else's life from a distance. He clutched a leather briefcase containing the diary and Marcus's letter, the evidence of his shattered world. James's chambers were in the inner temple, surrounded by centuries of legal tradition. His brother took one look at Edward's face and immediately closed his office door, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey despite the early hour. "Good God, Edward, you look like death. What's happened?" Edward took a long drink before speaking. "I need your counsel, James, not as a judge, but as my brother. What I'm about to tell you, it changes everything." Over the next hour, Edward revealed everything, finding the diary, Catherine's affair, Alexander's true parentage, the letter from Marcus. James listened without interrupting, his expression growing more grave with each revelation. When Edward finally fell silent, James leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. "Christ, Edward, I don't know what to say." "The memorial service is in 5 days," Edward said. "How can I speak about our happy marriage? How can I listen to Alexander praise his mother? But if I cancel, everyone will want to know why." James was quiet for a long moment, his legal mind working through the implications. "The first question," he said carefully, "is whether Alexander needs to know. Would telling him serve any purpose beyond destroying his world?" "He has a right to know who his father was," Edward argued weakly. "Does he? Marcus is dead. Catherine is dead. The only person who would suffer from this revelation is Alexander. And you, of course." James leaned forward. "Edward, you raised that boy. You're his father in every way that matters. But it's all based on a lie. Is your love for him a lie? Were all those years of raising him, teaching him, being proud of him, were those lies?" Edward shook his head slowly. No. Those were real." "Then perhaps that's your answer. Catherine made a choice to protect you and Alexander from this truth. Perhaps honoring that choice is the most loving thing you can do." Edward pulled out Marcus's letter. "But there's this, his biological father's last words to him." James studied the sealed envelope. "You could burn it. Let the secret die with those who created it." "Could you do that, if you were in my position?" James sighed deeply. "I honestly don't know. But I do know this. Once you tell Alexander, you can't untell him. There's no going back from that revelation. Take time to think before you do anything irreversible." They talked for another hour, James helping Edward work through the practical and emotional implications of each choice. Finally, James asked, "What about the memorial service?" Edward had been dreading this question. "I can't do it, James. I can't stand up there and pretend." "Then don't pretend," James suggested. "Speak about the Catherine you knew, the woman who was a devoted mother, who loved her family, who struggled with her own humanity. You don't have to lie, Edward. Just don't tell the whole truth." As Edward prepared to leave, James gripped his shoulder. "Whatever you decide about Alexander, I'll support you. But remember, that young man loves you as his father. Don't let Catherine's secret destroy that bond." The train ride back to Raven's Hollow gave Edward time to think. James was right about one thing. His love for Alexander was real, had always been real. But could their relationship survive being built on such a fundamental deception? And if he kept the secret, could he live with himself? Back at the manor, Edward found himself drawn to Alexander's old room, preserved much as it had been when he left for university. Cricket trophies, school photographs, artwork from various ages decorated the space. Edward picked up a framed photo from Alexander's graduation day, the two of them in academic robes, both beaming with pride. They looked like father and son. They felt like father and son. Did DNA really matter more than a lifetime of love? His phone rang, startling him from his reverie. Alexander's name appeared on the screen. "Father, I wanted to check on you. You seemed so unwell this weekend." Edward gripped the phone tightly. "I'm fine, Alexander. Just dealing with memories. I know it's hard. But we'll get through the memorial together. You won't be alone up there." The love and concern in Alexander's voice nearly broke Edward's composure. "Alexander, there's something—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Father, what is it?" Edward closed his eyes, seeing Catherine's final words in his mind. "Nothing. I just wanted to say, you've been a wonderful son, the best son a father could ask for." There was a pause before Alexander responded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Father. That means everything to me. I love you too." After they ended the call, Edward sat in Alexander's childhood room, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on love, if not on truth. The diary had revealed Catherine's secret, but now Edward faced his own choice, whether to pass that burden on to the next generation or to carry it alone. As darkness fell over Ravenshollow Manor, Edward made his way back to his study. He had a memorial speech to write, one that would honor the complex woman Catherine had been, without revealing the secret that had defined their lives. And he had a decision to make about Alexander and the letter that could change everything. The portrait of their family still hung above the fireplace, unchanged by the revelations of the past few days. But Edward saw it differently now, not as a lie, but as a different kind of truth. A truth about love that transcended biology, about the family they had chosen to be despite the secrets that lay beneath. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Edward allowed himself to grieve. For Catherine, for himself, for the innocent love they had once shared, and for the heavy burden of truth that was now his alone to bear. The morning of Catherine's memorial service dawned gray and misty, as if nature itself was mourning. Edward stood before his mirror, adjusting his black tie with trembling hands. He had barely slept, spending the night rehearsing his speech and wrestling with his decision about Alexander. The diary and Marcus's letter lay locked in his study safe. He had read and reread both so many times that passages were burned into his memory. Each reading brought new pain, but also new understanding of the woman he had married and the impossible position she had found herself in. Guests were already arriving at the manor. Edward could hear car doors closing, muted conversations drifting up from the entrance hall. Many of these people had known Catherine for decades. They had attended dinner parties where she played the perfect hostess, charity events where she had been gracious and kind, family celebrations where she had seemed the embodiment of a happy wife and mother. None of them knew the woman who had poured her anguish onto those diary pages. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Alexander entered, impeccably dressed in a dark suit. But Edward noticed the shadows under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. His son, and despite everything, Edward could not stop thinking of him as his son, was grieving too. "The guests are gathering in the great hall," Alexander said. "Are you ready?" Edward nodded, not trusting his voice. As they walked together toward the stairs, Alexander spoke quietly. Father, I've been thinking, after the memorial, maybe you should come stay with me in London for a while. This house, it must be full of painful memories right now. The irony of the statement nearly made Edward stumble. If only Alexander knew just how painful those memories had become. That's kind of you, he managed. We'll see. The great hall was filled with familiar faces. Edward accepted condolences mechanically, shaking hands, nodding at kind words about Catherine. His brother James stood near the podium, offering silent support. Elizabeth, Alexander's fiancée, was there too, her hand linked with Alexander's, her presence a reminder of the future generation that would be built on the foundation of the past. When it came time for the speeches, the local vicar spoke first, offering traditional words of comfort and resurrection. Then family friends shared memories, Catherine's work with the local orphanage, her beautiful garden parties, her devotion to her family. Each speaker painted a portrait of the woman the world had known, and it was a lovely portrait indeed. Finally, it was Edward's turn. He approached the podium on unsteady legs, his prepared speech in hand. Looking out at the assembled mourners, he saw Alexander in the front row, eyes bright with unshed tears, waiting to hear his father honor his mother's memory. Edward set aside his prepared remarks and spoke from his heart. Catherine was complex, he began, his voice stronger than he expected. Like all of us, she was not perfect. She carried burdens that she shared with no one, struggled with choices that had no easy answers. But what I can tell you with absolute certainty is that she loved deeply, perhaps too deeply at times. He saw some confused looks, but pressed on. She loved this community, giving countless hours to help those in need. She loved this estate, nurturing its gardens like they were her children. She loved our son Alexander with a fierce devotion that never wavered, even when it cost her dearly. Edward's eyes found Alexander's. And yes, she loved me. Not perfectly, perhaps, but genuinely. We don't get to choose how people love us, only whether we accept that love with all its imperfections. He paused, gathering himself. Catherine taught me that love and truth are not always companions. Sometimes love requires silence. Sometimes protecting those we care about means carrying burdens they need never know about. She made choices I might not have made, but they came from love, always from love. The room was utterly silent. Edward could see James nodding slightly, understanding the layers in his words. In her final days, Edward continued, Catherine told me she had regrets, things she wished she had done differently. Don't we all? But she also said she regretted nothing about the life we built together, the family we created, the love we shared. I choose to believe her. I choose to honor not just the woman she was, but the woman she tried to be. Edward's voice broke slightly. Catherine wasn't a saint. She was human with all the frailty that implies. But she was our human, my wife, Alexander's mother, your friend, and that's how I choose to remember her. He stepped back from the podium to scattered, slightly confused applause. Alexander was wiping his eyes, clearly moved but also puzzled by some of his father's words. Edward returned to his seat, feeling lighter somehow. He had spoken truthfully, if not completely. Alexander took the podium next, and Edward steeled himself. But his son's speech was beautiful, focusing on childhood memories, his mother's guidance, her encouragement of his career. Listening to him, Edward was struck by how much of Catherine lived on in Alexander, not just Marcus's artistic sensibilities, but Catherine's compassion, her way of seeing the best in people, her quiet strength. After the service, as guests mingled in the drawing room for the reception, James approached Edward. "That was well done," he said quietly. "Very well done." "I couldn't lie," Edward replied, "but I couldn't destroy her memory either. You found a third way. Catherine would be proud. As the afternoon wore on, Edward noticed Alexander watching him with concern. Finally, as the last guests were departing, his son approached. "Father, your speech. It was beautiful, but also strange. What did you mean about love requiring silence?" Edward looked at this young man he had raised, seeing echoes of both Catherine and Marcus in his features, but also seeing the person Alexander had become through their influence. "Your mother wasn't perfect, Alexander. No one is, but her imperfections don't diminish her love for us." Alexander frowned. "Father, what aren't you telling me?" This was the moment. Edward could reveal everything, hand over the diary and letter, shatter Alexander's world with the truth. Or he could do what Catherine had done, choose love over truth. "Your mother had secrets," Edward said carefully. "Things she never shared, burdens she carried alone. I recently learned about some of them." Alexander's face paled. "What kind of secrets?" Edward placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "The kind that don't matter anymore? She's gone, Alexander. What matters is that she loved us and we loved her. Everything else is just details." "But do you trust me?" Edward interrupted. Alexander nodded slowly. "Of course. Then trust me when I say that some stones are better left unturned. Your mother made choices to protect this family. I'm choosing to honor those choices." Alexander searched his father's face for a long moment. "Is this why you've been so upset? These secrets?" "Yes, but I've made my peace with them now." They stood in silence for a moment, before Alexander spoke again. "Will you tell me someday? When you're ready?" Edward thought of the diary locked in his safe, of Marcus's letter that would remain forever undelivered. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps some secrets should die with those who kept them." That evening, after Alexander had returned to London and the staff had retired, Edward sat alone in his study. He took out the diary and Marcus's letter one final time. The fireplace crackled invitingly. He could burn them now, ensure that the secret would die with him. Or he could preserve them, leave the choice to Alexander after his own death. Both options had merit. Both had consequences. In the end, Edward chose a middle path. He kept the diary but burned Marcus's letter, watching the unopened envelope curl and blacken in the flames. The diary would go into a safety deposit box with instructions that it be destroyed unopened upon his death unless Alexander specifically asked for family documents. It was a compromise, preserving the possibility of truth while making its discovery unlikely. As the letter turned to ash, Edward felt a strange peace settle over him. He had chosen to be the guardian of Catherine's secret rather than its revealer. Like Catherine herself, he would carry this burden out of love. Days turned into weeks, and life at Ravenshollow slowly found a new rhythm. Edward threw himself into estate work, finding solace in the routine of management and planning. When Alexander visited, there was a new understanding between them, unspoken but real. Alexander stopped pressing for answers, and Edward stopped looking like he was drowning in secrets. The wedding planning began in earnest, with Elizabeth bringing new life to the manor as she and Alexander discussed flowers and guest lists. Watching them together, Edward saw the cycle beginning anew, two people in love, building a future together, unaware of what trials and secrets might await them. One evening, as they all dined together, Elizabeth asked about family traditions they might incorporate into the wedding. Alexander mentioned how his mother had always insisted on fresh lavender in the bouquets, how his father had taught him the importance of personally greeting every guest. "Your parents must have had a beautiful wedding," Elizabeth said. Edward smiled, remembering that day 30 years ago. "It was perfect," he said honestly. Catherine was radiant. I thought I was the luckiest man alive. You were, Alexander said firmly. You and Mother had something special. Edward nodded. They had indeed had something special. Not the perfect marriage he had once believed in, but something more complex, more human, more real. A marriage that had weathered secrets and silence, betrayal and forgiveness, truth and lies. Later that night, Edward stood in the portrait gallery, looking at the paintings of past Blackwood lords and ladies. Soon, his own portrait would hang here, and someday, Alexander's. The family line would continue, built on love, if not on blood. He paused before a landscape painting he had never paid much attention to before. A view of the estate's grounds in summer, painted with remarkable skill and emotion. His heart skipped as he read the artist's signature in the corner. M. Ashford. So Catherine had displayed one of Marcus's paintings after all, hiding it in plain sight among the family portraits. Edward studied it with new eyes, seeing the beauty Marcus had captured, understanding why Catherine had been drawn to his artistic soul during that lonely summer. Instead of anger, Edward felt a strange gratitude. Without that summer, without Marcus, there would be no Alexander. The son he loved would never have existed. Perhaps Catherine had been right. Some betrayals lead to blessings too precious to regret. Edward left the painting where it hung and walked back to his study. On his desk was a letter from Alexander, formally asking permission to hold the wedding at Ravenshollow, speaking of continuing family traditions, of the children he and Elizabeth hoped to have, who would run through these same halls. Edward picked up his pen and began to write his response, granting not just permission, but his blessing. As he wrote, he thought about the nature of family, of truth, of love. He had learned that blood alone didn't make a father, that perfect honesty wasn't always the highest virtue, that love could survive betrayal and secrets and time. The memorial was over, the decision made, the secret safely locked away. Edward had chosen to be the father Alexander believed him to be rather than the victim of Catherine's deception. In doing so, he had found a kind of peace. Outside, the Ravenshollow gardens bloomed in the spring moonlight, keeping their own secrets about the lovers who had once walked among them. The manor stood solid and enduring, ready to shelter new generations of Blackwoods who would create their own stories, their own secrets, their own imperfect but genuine love. Edward sealed his letter to Alexander and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to choose between truth and kindness. But tonight, he was simply a father who loved his son, a man who had loved his imperfect wife, a lord who would protect his family's happiness even at the cost of his own peace of mind. As he turned out the lights, Edward whispered into the darkness, "I forgive you, Catherine, and I understand." The words hung in the air for a moment, before silence reclaimed the great house. Somewhere in London, Alexander slept peacefully, unaware of the gift his fathers, both of them, had given him. The gift of ignorance, the blessing of an unshattered world, the mercy of a love that chose silence over truth. And in that silence, the Blackwood family endured.